Welcome, everyone, to our third episode here at the Restoration Podcast. We are getting together and we are going to be revisiting our most recent sermon as we walk through our series called 1 Week, as we come into the second section of chapter 11. My name is Neil Strickland, and I'm part of the teaching team here at Restoration.
My name is Kayla, and I'm the director of Discipleship here at Restoration Church.
I'm Terry Ishee, and I serve as pastor here at Restoration.
And I'm Jeff Lakin. I'm one of the elders here at Restoration.
So I just mentioned that we were in the second section of Mark chapter 11. Terry, do you mind recapping kind of what was going on, what you were talking about this past Sunday?
Yeah, so as you kind of labeled it, the temple tantrum, which I thought was hilarious. I had never heard that before. It's so good. 2 weeks ago, Todd spoke, and Jesus is entering into Jerusalem, coming to the temple, and so everyone's applauding and worshiping Jesus. And so I this past week, I picked up in verse 12. This is Jesus kind of entering into the temple, but before he gets to the temple, where he overturns tables and kind of drives out the money changers and kind of speaks to the idea of like, hey, what's going on here? This is supposed to be a house of prayer. We get this sandwich, right? So Mark has a little Mark sandwich where you have the fig tree. And so it's an acted out parable of the fig tree. So we get an entry. The disciples are walking towards the temple, and Jesus notices a fig tree over there, walks up to this fully leaved tree, hoping there might be some fruit. There's no fruit there. And so he curses the tree, which seems really harsh. But it is an opportunity for him as a rabbi to teach a lesson, kind of a big idea of something that we get into. And, I actually didn't get to talk about this in my sermon because we just ran out of time. It was going to be one of those things where this was going to be an hour-long sermon. And I'm so grateful we have this podcast so I can actually finish the sermon. So this will be a 1-hour podcast. I'm just kidding. And then we have the back half of Jesus after he spends the day at the temple. There is a really sweet little line right there. He spends quite a bit of time there in the temple. He leaves the temple. And then as they're leaving the next day, Peter notices that same fig tree that is now withered from the root up and is dead. And Jesus speaks a little bit to a big idea, a really big idea. And then there's this sweet, beautiful little conversation around prayer and forgiveness. And that kind of ends our time that we covered this past week. So anything that I missed, Kayla, you want to add in? Was it sufficient?
No, that was great. Great story recap. I am excited to hear, I'm excited to hear you talk a little bit more about the second half of the fig tree, because I even had a couple people come up to me to be like, what happened with the fig tree? And so I'm excited to hear what got cut from that.
So for me, one of the key takeaways that kind of jumps out when I was thinking about this and what you had talked about was that section where you kind of described the temple being a way of collecting money for a war chest. And that really surprised me. You described it as a way of them saving up for a revolution. And what I guess jumped out at me is that on Todd's message, there was this expectation for Jesus to be a revolutionary. He was coming in, people were screaming Hosanna, which is save us to God. So they see this guy walking in, they call him the son of David. That is, he is the correct, true king of Israel. And they are sort of expecting a revolutionary. And you would think that they would connect the two. Maybe we should just take the money and fund Jesus, and that way he can lead a revolution. And I started thinking more about it is about what if this is more about control? What if their desire is not only do the revolution the way they want to do it, but have complete control over the revolution?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think it's important that we note this is some heavy speculation. I mentioned that on Sunday. This is my reading of it. There's some scholars that believe this. And so anytime we exegete the scriptures, there are certain things we can say, hey, we feel fairly confident this is what this is. And so there are some other interpretations of this. And so we don't want that to be a stumbling block for anyone. But when you read it in the context of scholarship around this passage, it makes sense. For so long, Israel was waiting for some sort of king, messiah, ruler who was going to come in and save the day. They were looking for the knight in shining armor, and they were looking for a warrior. They were looking for a David. I mean, David had his mighty men. Jesus had his 12. He rolled up with fishermen and a tax collector, and so it was a little different than David. But he was the son of David, as they were looking for. It was just very, very different.
Jesus, you taught us how to heal people. Are you going to teach us how to fight people? Like, when is that coming?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and I'd love, Jeff, to get your thoughts on this. There are a lot of people who have different opinions on how Jesus's posture, and even had a conversation today. It was my interpretation of Jesus a little too nonviolent, right? And maybe, I don't know. But what I do know is what we know of the character of Jesus. We know he embodied self-control, and that was the point I hope I made on Sunday. And we know that Jesus was without sin. And so there is probably some sort of in between where he was probably stern. I'm a father. I think I've had moments with my daughter where I was stern with her, and yet I don't think I sinned. I don't think I broke any type of bad parenting rule or anything like that. So the two aren't mutually exclusive, right? So there is that in between. It's just we just don't know. We don't know that level and what that posture looks like. But what we do know is the nature of Jesus, and all we can do is speculate on what that might have looked like. So I'm pretty guaranteed that he had immense self-control in that. And I just don't see a deep, violent streak in Jesus. So there is somewhere in between those two, ranges.
Yeah, I think when Jesus talks about this enacted parable, that's an interesting word. That's probably an idea that we need to flesh out a little bit, because we talk about parables as stories that may or may not have happened, but this is something that Jesus is acting out right in front of them. And I think there is a tension there with Jesus and what his response was. And I think if we go back to the Old Testament, I think there are plenty of opportunities where God got really frustrated and really angry. So is righteous anger a bad thing? And this to me is a picture of the very heart of God. Like, you people have forgotten what our responsibility to the Gentiles is. I'm going to make you a great nation so that you can be a blessing. And they had forgotten that, and they had kind of pushed that aside because they were interested in, God, when are you going to come back and be our God? And when are we going to be your special people? And when are you going to do what we want you to do? We want all those blessings that it's talked about in the Old Testament, but we're forgetting our purpose. And so much of the purpose of Israel was wrapped up in that temple interaction. So I think it's okay that Jesus was a little bit angry. Like, I think it was a righteous indignation of you people have forgotten who you are. You've forgotten who I am, and you've forgotten what your purpose is in this world. So I think that adds a little depth of a little bit of permission for Jesus to be a little bit more angry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Jesus is just full of tension. Like, we talked about that at the last podcast a little bit, that he is king and worthy of worship, and yet he comes as a servant. And so I think that this is just another case where everyone wants to put Jesus in a box, and including us in modern day times. And I just think that he lives in that tension and kind of goes beyond boundaries. The picture that just came to my mind is when a parent slams on the brakes of a car, not out of anger, but to like get kids' attention. I think that there are kind of those scary moments for parents when you're doing something to make a point, when you're like, my teacher used to, like, anytime we got too loud in one of my grades in high school, used to slam a book on the desk because that got everyone's attention. And I love, like you said, Jesus's self-control, that this wasn't an anger outburst, that there was some premeditation, there was some deliberateness to Jesus's action. In Mark, we see just the passage before you preached, and you even brought it up, that he went around, he looked in the temple. In another one of the Gospels, we see him making a whip before he cleans out this part of the temple. And that takes time and thoughtfulness. Like, it wasn't an outburst, but it was to get attention.
Something that sticks out to me again about this period of time of Jesus' contemplation is that this is not a new system. It had been running probably since he was a boy. This is not the first Passover he showed up and then suddenly saw. This was the first year they had the markets happening and the
That's right.
first time they had that. So he probably, for 30 plus years, had been watching this go down.
Yeah, that's a great point, that this wasn't his first rodeo. This wasn't the first time he was seen by this or shocked by this.
But it's also kind of the first time that Jesus was stepping into that and saying, you know what? This temple's going to go away and it's going to
Yeah.
be me. So
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty profound idea in this.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to kind of the main point of this passage that I kind of tried to lead with as much as possible. I hope I was clear, is that I really do believe that Jesus' his posture and priority and point in this was that he is the living temple, right? He is replacing the temple. He's replacing the very thing that people had even his whole life had journeyed to pilgrimage to do their business with God. And so that goes back to the fig tree, this acted out parable. Jeff, do you want to give a little bit of just thought and idea on this idea of what an acted out parable is?
Yeah, I think as a rabbi, Jesus is going along and he's looking for ways to connect what he's going to be, like his actions over the next few verses, with something that is tangible. And so the parable is it's an enacted parable because what Jesus is actually pointing to is the destruction of the temple, in the same way that he's destroying the fig tree becomes a symbol of the temple. And Jesus is saying, like, you're not, I don't know how far to take this, but you're not producing the fruit that the temple and all the temple stands for is supposed to. And so he goes in and he clears out the temple, and then the sandwich part of it at the end is that the fig tree is dead, and then Jesus makes these really strong statement of, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that he says will come to pass and it will be done for him. And it's just a picture of, like, yeah, the temple is going to be destroyed and it's going to be pushed into the sea. It's going to be, some 40 years later, it's going to no longer exist. And so I think he's using the fig tree as but it's in real time. It's not just a story, but it's like, hey guys, here's a living, breathing example of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Did they get it?
I think they missed it. They didn't see it. And that was the ending of my sermon that I didn't really get to nail down. Is, we have this fig tree, which is the acted out parable. It looks fruitful from the outside, but it's not doing what it should be doing, and so it's to be destroyed, just like the temple. And then I love the prayer at the end, because it's like, if you didn't catch the acted out parable, I'm actually going to give you a verbal prayer of how to pray this very destruction. For those who might be listening or who missed it, Jesus says you can take that mountain and throw it in the ocean. Well, the mountain that he's referring to is the very mountain, the foundation that the temple is built on. So, what Jesus is actually saying is you can take that mountain, you can take that mount, the temple, and you can toss it in the ocean. So he's even giving more speculation or more hints at the temple's going to be destroyed, and I am the new temple. I'm the living temple. But I love that even in that prayer, and this skipping a little bit ahead to some next steps and some actionable ways to walk away from this, is I love that even though he was, whatever level of anger and indignation that he had towards the scribes, the chief priests, the money changers, everyone in the temple, he says, in your posture of prayer of taking the mountain and throwing it into the sea, he actually says, take the posture of forgiveness. And so even though Jesus was angry and was upset and was offended and upset by the actions of the temple, he still had forgiveness and love for these individuals. And again, this just goes back to the rhetoric and the narrative of Jesus, even in the Sermon on the Mount, that we're to love our neighbors. Yes, we're to love our enemies and pray for them. And so he's actually praying for those who he just corrected.
But how can forgiveness and all of that happen if the temple's not there? Like that's the tension. I love that, like the
Yeah.
tension. That's my favorite word in scripture, is the tension, is that, wow, if the temple's removed, then forgiveness is coming from a different place. And
Yeah.
and I think Jesus is doing the old pointing the fingers towards his head of like, yeah, that's going to come through me and the sacrifice that I'm about to make for you. So yeah, that's a beautiful picture.
Just going back around, are there any other points or thoughts that you guys had that just jumped out to you that was inspired by Terry's amazing message?
Yeah, one of the things that struck me was Terry's imagery of where all of this was happening. The sale of animals and money changers was all happening where Gentiles were invited in, where non-Jews were invited to connect with God. And I loved the cultural point that this court was being used as a road to just walk in a straight line rather than being held in reverence as a place where everyone is invited in. And so those pictures of the Jewish people getting the quiet, holy place to worship God, but the Gentiles were being left to this loud, busy, distracting market really stuck out to me and made me think a lot about what are some barriers that maybe we don't realize as Christians that we have in our churches, in our social circles, that stand in the way of non-Christians kind of getting a taste of Jesus.
One of the things that reminds me of is that there was a process of being able to actually pay for your own sacrifice. If you're a Gentile, you can't take a kosher animal and walk up and go into that court of the Jewish men to be able to go through and do the sacrifice process and pay and take it to the priest. Instead, you could pay somebody to then do that sacrifice for you. So there was just this other layer of, you can sort of kind of participate, but not to the same degree and not to the same level. And it may cost you more because they could probably upcharge the Gentiles that wanted to use the temple as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find fascinating in this passage, and even as I was studying and pulling the talk together, was how just poorly this part of the temple was just mistreated. I think it's just one of those paramount things. And this is the thing, I think, generation after generation, this is 2,000 years ago, and we still have these types of behavior happening where people are, cut out or pushed aside, or spaces that were meant for them, they're removed from that. And not to make this overtly political or anything like that, please don't take this as like words to go get on a soapbox for your own sake. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing here. I think Jesus is being really clear that he's saying, hey, I am the King and Messiah for all people. And I think he's wanting to reclaim that space for our brothers and sisters that are Gentiles. And so I think one of the things that we think through and process is like even how we gather on a Sunday morning, right? So every Sunday morning, we turn the YMCA gym into a sanctuary. We turn it into a sacred space where we gather. Now, Sunday morning, where the word is preached and worship and communion is taken, that's not the only sacred spaces we have. We can create a sacred space really anywhere, but it is an intentional space that we are creating that is sacred, because this is where we are inviting God to come and be with us and speak to us and guide us and inspire us and stretch us and grow us. And even as we reflect on how we gather together, I think it is important that we check ourselves from time to time. Like, how are we treating the spaces that were meant for worship? Are we taking advantage of that? I don't think there's anything we do that's fairly egregious on a Sunday morning at Restoration. But again, I think it's always good to check hearts and motives and how we show up in the things that we do. I think that's always really just helpful.
I agree with that. And I think it's interesting, though, in this context of Jesus could have come in and said, here are the 5 things that I want to do to fix the
Mm,
temple. And he probably would have corrected the court of Gentiles, and he probably would have, I think he would have corrected the court of women as well. And the fact that Jesus predicted and acted out this whole scene of the destruction of the temple, and not only did he predict the destruction of it, but he kind of stepped in and replaced it. And he said,
yeah.
I am the new living temple, which is messianic, which is like, who could do that except God? And so I think that's just a powerful thing here of he wasn't correcting the temple, he wasn't fixing it, he was
Yeah.
replacing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's significant.
As I've been reading this passage, and I shared this with Terry earlier this week, it really stood out to me when Jesus calls them robbers. And that is a reference back to a Jeremiah passage. And when I looked in my Bible when I was reading it back, it actually, the headline that my Bible chose is false trust in the temple. And
Mm,
I was just reflecting on how that passage talks about, hey, you guys are doing everything wrong. You're excluding the alien. You are worshiping other gods. Like, you're not living out true devotion to God. And then you're expecting the temple to make you saved, to give you safety. And I've been reflecting on how sometimes I think that we view Old Testament God and Jesus as like two separate things, when really the triune God is consistent in all time, and how the methodology of connecting with God has changed through the Old Testament to the New Testament. But God has always been asking for everyone's entire life, entire devotion, for his way of life in his kingdom to be about the outsider, to be about blessing the nations, and to be consistent, to be not hypocrites, as we've kind of talked about on Sunday morning and on here. And now God is changing the methodologies. The methodology is now Jesus, but the ask has been the same throughout time, to be fully devoted to God inside the temple and outside the temple.
Kayla, I love how you're just sort of driving us towards that question of, okay, so what does that mean for us today? How do
Yeah, I
we
can't not.
live
I'm
that?
an application person.
Yeah. So how are you, or what do you think when we look at the community of restoration, how can we do that?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of beautiful examples in our community of people who do this just naturally, that aren't trusting in a gathering to be the place to connect with God, but exude Jesus as King throughout all of their life. And so that's what I think the practical application is here is, are we worshiping Jesus as King on Sunday or however you worship, but also allowing that to influence and really have say over every other area of your life, including how you treat the outsider, how you're welcoming people into your life and life with Jesus, and how you're even making intentional choices of how you set up your life. Like I think about Terry talking about the money changers. That was not necessarily a bad thing. It was a needed service, but maybe there could have been some more intentionality with how it was set up and the consequences. And so, like, are we being intentional through thinking through our choices and making sure we're loving God and loving others with every choice we make?
Sometimes the things that we do and put in place actually serve as boundary markers for people that prevent them from moving in instead of inviting them in. And so we can put up these low walls or whatever that limit people or limit their accessibility or whatever to our community, that we need to consider how do we tear those things down. And I think that was largely a case here with the Gentiles of, had they made it so difficult for the Gentiles and so expensive and so prohibitive of them coming and learning and becoming a part of that community, that they've lost their way. And I think we can do the same thing with our rules, with our, legalism can very much be that way. Or I guess the best way to say it is, do our practices limit people coming to worship the Lord?
Mm. Yeah, I love that. Are we stressors on that, or are we someone's that opens that up, right? And so we can actually prevent people, or we can give them access. And so one of the things I would add on that's related to that is I think it's important in our life to frequently have self-reflection, self-awareness. Now, please don't hear what I'm not saying. I don't want to belittle or beat a dead horse, and I'm not trying to challenge or question your faith over and over again, right? But looking at the first century Jews and Gentiles in this setting, when they're looking and witnessing all of this, they completely missed it. They did not have eyes to see this. Jesus gave hint after hint after hint, and they just didn't see it. And so I think we need to reflect, is like asking ourselves the question, how am I responding to Jesus as King? Do I actually see it, or am I missing it? How do I think about Jesus? How do I look at Jesus? Is he a good guy? Is he a wise teacher? Is he a friend? Like, is he my guy for when it's stressful, right? Like, just like you got a guy for, small engine repair, you got a guy for plumbing. He's like, oh, when it's stressful, that's my guy. That's who I go to. Is he a role model? Is he savior? Does Jesus like cap out at savior? He can save me. He can give me eternal life, but that's it. Or is he actually King and Lord? Like, does he fully receive all of that? And then I think, how are we responding to Jesus in that everyday life? I think that's huge. And so are we coming back over and over again and reflecting those things? And I think it's a task that has to happen over and over again. I think that's just part of healthy reflection. And Kayla kind of mentioned this earlier. One of the things that I think is beautiful about being a part of a community is that reflection doesn't have to happen alone. Like, it can happen in community where we can actually affirm each other and say, hey, this is how I see Jesus is the King of your life. Like, you're like, here's an example of how you laid down your life, or you did something that would have been way easier another way. And I think we can like speak into that and speak life into people in that way.
I think of the warning of how, or I think of a warning where many of us can also do the opposite of, you don't know that person, don't include them. Maybe that's not the way you should do things, just from our own ways of getting our lenses mixed up and seeing people inappropriately. Another thing you said in your message that really stuck out to me was that they threw the Gentiles out with the bathwater, that Rome became a way of coloring the entirety of the group. And we were just talking about the idea of putting up these little barriers that keep people out. That's almost passively, because I'm just trying to keep the church the way I want it to keep it. And I accidentally put up these barriers that become a stumbling block for people who want to enter the kingdom. And then there's this other more nefarious approach of, I'm actively deciding you don't belong here and I don't want you in here because I've associated you with something else. Maybe it's something you did in your past. Maybe it's who you voted for. For some reason, I have this idea that you aren't the person to come in here. You're a good person, you're fine, but you're not part of us.
You're not our kind of people.
I think going back to the intentionality piece, sometimes I don't even think that we are trying to exclude people, but if you're not actively trying to include people and be an includer, we just in our human nature like to hole up with people that are like us. And so I think it's not just about making sure we're not excluding people, but making sure we're actively including. I have to believe that the Pharisees weren't all, and all the religious leaders weren't all actively trying to exclude Gentiles. They just weren't being intentional with inclusion. And I think that that is our charge.
If we really stop and if we historically study what the temple meant to the people, it was the religious and political heart and core of their society. And for Jesus to replace that with himself means that Jesus is saying, I need to be the religious, political center of your life, of your people, of your society. And that has a profound effect on everything else. Of the temple was everything. The temple was what they longed for God to come and be present again, to dwell in the temple. Like they longed for, this was the sign that we're really God's people and we're his special possession. And yet for Jesus to come and say that it was going to be destroyed and removed, and that he was stepping into the place of the temple, their reaction was what? We need to get rid of this guy. This guy is, he's stepping over the bounds of even a good prophet. This is beyond anything we've ever heard before. So
Yeah, and I think that's a great summary of this whole section right here. This is not a passage of like that moment. It's not like a side quest. Oh, Jesus stopped by the temple on his way to do big business, and he just wanted to be a little rebel rouse. He just wanted to ruffle the feathers in the temple. He's actually like giving out some huge implications of who he is, what's about to go down, and how everyone, all people should respond. And so the temple was everything to people. And Jesus is now saying, I need to be your everything. Will you bow the knee? Will you confess the tongue that I am king? And so I think that's a fantastic summary. Thank you, Jeff.
even the idea that Jesus becomes the ultimate sacrifice for us, that he sacrifices himself, that's a temple thing. Like you would offer the sacrifices in the temple, but Jesus is like, I'm going to offer a sacrifice for all people of all times that is inclusive, that is beyond what the scope of anything that you've ever offered me before.
So rich. Good stuff.
Well, with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up what we've been doing this afternoon. And we would like to leave everyone with a blessing. This blessing encompasses the ideas of peace, wholeness, and the way things are intended to be. And with that, we say shalom.